When I say the phrase, good grief, what do you think of? Charlie Brown, right? You could just hear Linus and Lucy saying, good grief, Charlie Brown, or Charlie Brown himself saying, good grief. Now, about a year ago, we talked about Charles Schulz, and we learned that Charlie Brown was fashioned as a character after Schulz's own life. He was always very timid and shy and never felt like he fit in with everyone else. And there really were only two things in Schulz's life that he really loved. He loved drawing, and he loved the little red-haired girl who was an actual person from his art school, and she broke his heart. Good grief. Now, we all love the Peanuts because it reflects the human condition. We're all trying to fit in. We're all struggling in some way. We all have so many setbacks. And Charlie Brown lives those setbacks for us, and we can laugh. We can laugh at the condition we find ourselves in. It's always as if life is throwing curveballs at us, and we're trying to catch them as best we can. There's one cartoon where Charlie Brown is trying to catch a fly ball. He has his mitt on, and he's running, and he's looking up, and he jumps over the fence, and he's still running, and he's still looking up, and he runs through some hedges, and he's still running. He runs through a house. He's still running. He finally gets to the perfect place. He puts his glove out, and the ball just plunks right in his glove, and then he drops it. Good grief. That's the human condition. We do the best we can, and we have to say that's all that we can do. Now, in our story today that Betty shared with us from Ruth, we have another story that mirrors for us the human condition. And this story is filled with grief. And it's interesting, though, that most of us are familiar with this story because of weddings. We often hear that portion read at weddings where Ruth says to her mother-in-law, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And we love that part much more than we love the rest of the story. So today, because it is All Saints' Day, and because we are thinking about those who have gone before us, let's look at this story again, and let's see if we can identify the different types of grief that we find. So let's see how many times that we can say, good grief, with Naomi in this story. Now, in the beginning of the story, they are all living in Bethlehem. And Bethlehem, that word means house of bread. But there's no bread. They're having a famine. So a whole family has to leave the house of bread looking for bread somewhere else. And they move to the far country of Moab, where there is food. It's a good move for them because they need to feed their family. I can remember when Keith and I, my husband, did that. We'd only been married maybe a year and a half. We were living in Paw Paw, Michigan at the time, and he lost his job, and we had no bread, and we all needed bread to pay the bills, right? The company offers him a job in the far country of, that way, Fort Wayne, Indiana. So in a weekend, we packed everything up and moved to Fort Wayne. I didn't realize until later the grief that came with that move. It was fun, it was exciting. We had a new house to live in, a city to explore, and I had to find another job, and all the things that went with that move kept us so busy that it wasn't until a bit later that the grief hit me. I was in a grocery store, and I could not find anything in the store. I couldn't find any of the brands I was used to. And it struck me then, what if my car doesn't start? What if I have car trouble? Who am I gonna call? If Keith's at work, I don't know a single person in this entire city. Every change brings grief. It doesn't have to be the loss of a person or a beloved pet. Every change brings its own grief. And Naomi is going through that grief in the first line of our story. She has left her extended family, all her friends, her neighbors. They've pulled the kids out of school, loaded the U-Haul, moved to Moab, which is a place where the Israelites were not exactly on good terms because they had to survive. And there is a level of grief that comes with those kinds of changes. Good grief. It might have been a good move, but there was still grief. Then, after they're there for a while, we don't know how long, Naomi's husband dies. So now she is stranded. She has lost the love of her life. She's lost her partner. And I know that many of you have gone through that. And you know how it hurts. And it can be a loss by death, and it can also be a loss by divorce. It's still grief. And it is a piercing kind of grief that you don't get over. You learn to live in it. Now, this is the human condition, is it not? That we know that we will die. We are probably the only creatures on the planet that are very clear that none of us will get out of here alive. And we cannot live with that weight of that knowledge on us. And so we don't face death until we absolutely have to. And when we do face it, sometimes we laugh at it like we did in our parking lot on Thursday night. Halloween brought all kinds of ghosts and skeletons and goblins out, and we laughed. We take our children out in costume, and we walk through the dark streets, and we go up to houses we don't know, and we ask for candy. We are laughing at death because the weight of it is so great. We need to add a little bit of good into the grief. Otherwise, it's unbearable. Now, if that wasn't enough for poor Naomi, there's more to come. But first, she has some good. Her sons get married. When we go to weddings, we enjoy it so much. We dance, we celebrate, we eat. Sometimes we drink. We are excited about this new couple. And I'm sure that Naomi was absolutely thrilled. She's going to have grandchildren. She's going to still have that big family she's always dreamed of. And they are all going to gather around her in her old age. And she is so thrilled. And then both her sons die. And we don't know how or why. All we know is they're gone. Now, this is a particularly piercing kind of grief when you lose a child. I talked with a parent last week who lost an adult child, and I know many of you have had this happen already. She said the grief hits you in waves. It never goes away, but it will hit you at a strange time, and then it will subside, and you'll feel okay for a while, and then it will hit you again, and you learn to develop a new normal of living in that grief. You need to add, if we can, a little bit of good into that grief. But it's so heavy and so weighty that we cannot. Now, Naomi, in her struggles with all of this grief, has even more grief when you think about it. She's a female alone in a land where you must have a male to support you or to protect you. She has lost all of that as well. And there are other kinds of grief that are not mentioned in this story. Some of us grieve our youth. We wish we could go back and do some things over. Some of us grieve for our health. Our bodies just will not cooperate when we tell them what to do. We grieve for the dreams that we had, that at a certain age we have to look back and say, that dream is not going to come true for me. Those are all different kinds of grief. We grieve for our future, the future we thought we were going to have that now we may not have. So as we think of all those kinds of griefs, let's look at Naomi and see what she did right and what she did that was maybe not so good. The first thing she does right is she cries loudly. We don't do that here. We generally suck it up so we look okay and then we cry when we get home. But Naomi and her daughters-in-law, she holds them and she clings to them. They kiss and they weep aloud. It says it twice in our reading today. Now, in that culture, that's more accepted than here. We have a Puritan background that hides all emotion. No grief, no joy, don't show any emotion at all. We will be stoic like the Puritans were. But stuffing our grief does not work. And we still try. I've had several people who were deep in grief and the tears are flowing down their cheeks and they apologize to me for their tears. Don't apologize for your tears. They are healthy and good. We have to stop thinking that grief is messy and stop saving it for when we're at home. But let people see your grief so that all of our friends will know that you're grieving and they can help. We are good at distracting ourselves through our grief too, staying so busy we don't have time to think about it. Maybe what we need time for is just to feel it. Now, Naomi does something that's not so healthy. She tries to send the only two people she has left in the world away from her. She tells Ruth and Orpah to go back to their families, get married again, have children. Don't stay with me, Naomi says, because God is against me and everything I love dies. It's the human condition. Some of us feel that way. One of her daughters-in-law leaves, but Ruth brings a little good into that grief. And she says, I will not leave you. I am here with you. We will stay together because together is how we get through grief. It's a rough story, is it not? When we really think about what happens in this story and how much grief there is, there's almost too much to bear. We all carry grief, and we all need a little good in that grief. And this group is much like the Peanuts gang. We all sometimes feel like Charlie Brown. We all want to say, good grief, what else can go wrong? And we're almost afraid to say that because we know something will. But we're all here to support one another. So this morning, I'm going to ask you to do something, to take an action, to show your grief, to greet your grief, to acknowledge your grief, to name it even if you want to. I'm going to ask the alkalites to come forward now with the candle lighters. And as they come forward, they are going to light their candle lighters with the light of Christ. And in a few moments, I'm going to invite you all to come forward. If you have noticed grief, as we've talked this morning, if you've come in here feeling grief, sorry about that, come and pick up a candle. Feel the weight of it in your hand. If you're at home, have your candle ready so that you can light yours with us. This represents your grief. It can be grief for someone who has died. It can be grief for yourself, for loss of your youth or your dreams or someone you loved or your pet, any kind of loss. Hold it and feel the weight of that grief. And then once you have acknowledged your grief, I'll wait till our candle lighters are in place. Carl, can you make it wide angle so that people at home can see? Then you come and allow them to share the light of Christ and add a little bit of good with your grief. And you take your candle and you can place it up here on the chancel railing. You can say what your grief is. You can name it if you want to. You can name it to yourself. But allow some good from the light of Christ to come into your grief this morning. We have some music to play, and as the music starts, please come as you feel led. If you cannot get up and come forward, ask someone next to you to light a candle for you.